Chapter 25. Bran. She waited until nightfall to make her assault. After hours of staring and studying through her visor, she felt she knew the face of the wall as thoroughly as possible. The ridge she had climbed, while providing an excellent perch for reconnaissance, did not present a favorable angle of approach. For that, she crossed to the next ridge, with a wooded slope of mature cedars that came down close to the foot of the next tower, allowing her to creep in the gathering darkness to within a stone's throw. The space between the forest and the tower was a forgotten place. No vegetation grew there, and animals feared to tread. A maintenance door stood barred and locked at the foot of the tower. It was reinforced and likely closely monitored. She had decided on climbing the seam, where the tower body jutted out from the face of the wall. She would be invisible to those inside the tower, and hopefully those in the next tower would not make her out in the darkness. The guards walked between towers in intervals of 15 to 20 minutes, likely assuming that the difference was enough to throw off intruders. But Sabrina had timed them throughout the afternoon, and had their intervals memorized. After tracking the last guard into the tower, she left her hiding place, crossed the scree bed at the foot of the ridge, and latched to the tower, the microfiber grip of her gloves expanding and contracting on the surface. A few feet up, she slipped, a fine dust of debris falling on her visor, shoulders, and the wall with a noise like soft static. She caught her breath, her muscles straining as she regained purchase. The surface of the wall was soft and granular, like sandstone. She had not calculated for that. Her suit could still grip, but she would have to move more slowly. She found a new rhythm, careful to maintain equal balance of push-pull between her arms and legs. The visor displayed her time. She had 7 minutes before the next guard returned, but she was still much lower than she had planned to be. As she reached the height of the walkway, she found that soft lights shone at foot level, casting the side of the tower in a ghostly glow. She fought an urge to look out over the land to the south, and swung to the northern face of the tower, where the faint light illuminating a footpath would not reach her. A few more minutes of climbing, and the tower windows were just above her. This would be the closest test. She had no way of seeing inward with the visual spectrum. Her infrared showed that there was no one on the other side of the wall, but its vision to the far end of the room was compromised. The only break in the smooth surface of glass was a support strut, a narrow corner where the glass gave way to stone. She had hoped it would be wider. It was even narrower up close. The wind gusted, buffeting her and whipping her ponytail to the side of her face. She decided there was no sense in waiting. This is when Lindsay would pray, she thought, reaching up her hand, letting it grip, pushing up with a foot, then a knee. She had planned to scramble up the portion quickly, but with the surface so unstable, she was forced to move inch by uncomfortable inch alongside the implacable glass. The midnight land reflected on either side of her, and the wind increased to a howl. She stopped to steady herself and catch her breath. The gusts sucked the air right out of her mouth. When they died down, she began moving again. The windows just below her she climbed with extra care so as not to send a rain of grit that would give her away. Sweat was rolling down her neck in rivulets. Her hands made loud scraping noises on the stone, which, in her intruder's paranoia, she was certain must be audible inside. The windows moved out of reach. She continued up the face of the tower. No alarms sounded, no floodlights swung around on her. The wind increased. She was higher than the top of any building in the Twin Cities. The forest was now a patch of undulating green that extended to the horizon. A flock of birds exploded from a tree as if suddenly disturbed, before settling down again. Even at the height of their flight, they were no more than specks to her. The wall at this height was more weather-beaten, its surface scoured by sand and wind, making it smoother and easier to grab. Although she did not dare become overconfident, she continued in her methodical crawl. She was now nearly halfway between the ring of windows and the top of the tower. One window remained in the space between. She had noticed that these upper windows were not smoked, and figures moved behind them at irregular intervals. Not a sentry post. More like a barracks. Her suit reminded her that her heart rate was increasing as she neared the window and peered in sidelong. 3 men in various states of uniform dress sat in a semicircle. One wore his collar open, one had stripped off his jacket. Another wore uniform trousers but a casual long-sleeved shirt. Their uniforms looked like her own patrol suit, except that the color scheme was grays and blacks instead of the familiar black and blue. The men's attention was directed to a monitor displaying what appeared to be a pitchball match. With gentle movements, Sabrina placed a listening pod on the glass. Deep male voices filled her ear, along with the breathless, unbroken commentary from the match. She could understand nothing. The rhythm of language was there, although it was faster than she could follow, full of words she did not know, and consonants from deep in the throat that were completely alien. But their laughter and gestures transported her easily to any after-hours session where officers watched a match. The game was a revelation. The rules of the match and the field were familiar, but the setting, the grass, ultra-green, the lines a brilliant white, so different from the dusty fields and trampled grass of the Fortinbras Stadium. The stands were nearly as large as the wall she clung to, jutting into the night sky, filled with thousands of people in colors of clothing she had never seen. A profusion rendered in sharper detail than any of the monitors in Fortinbras could, even in the head ministry. It made no sense. She studied the room. Lest she forget this was a military outpost, racks of plasma rifles lined the walls, as well as helmets she recognized for the T-shaped opening on their faces. One of the teams scored, and the men screamed, making Sabrina's eardrums flutter. When she yanked the listening pod from the glass, she could still hear cheering and whooping through the window. The men felt too close. She reached up and continued climbing, finally reaching the railing at the peak of the tower and pulling herself over. The red light set on a black metal stem was bigger than it had appeared from the ground, and was as wide across as her forearm. Next to the light was a hatch to the floors below, and a fold-away glider, with its wings and turbines eerily similar to an Elved. The wind whipped powerfully, and she steadied herself by holding onto the light stem, walking unsteadily towards the far end of the tower, her muscles exhausted from the climb. The desert opened up in a rush of air that shook the sand from her shoulders, swirling it around her like a robe. What she saw was remarkable for its banality. The lands were indistinct from the lands she had already traveled through, except that this landscape was forbidden. Absent were any signs of blast craters, glowing radioactive soil, ruined cities, or seared rock. No skeletons, human or machine, sat moldering as she might have imagined in the deadlands of a global holocaust. The patrol suit picked up 0 radiation. She flipped through the lenses, her vision fading to black when she examined the landscape for rays on that end of the spectrum. None at all. Something caught her eye, and its glow in the visible spectrum and in the infrared was so bright she was surprised that she had not noticed it before. She zoomed in on the cluster of brightness to the southwest, and her heart jumped. At first, she could not comprehend what she was seeing. It looked like mesas and rock chimneys lit with radioactive afterglow, or perhaps an illusion in the desert atmosphere, a rare refocusing of starlight refracted into milky streams and rectilinear columns. But she knew a city when she saw one. The grid lines and gauges projected on her visor told her how far away and how large it truly was, much larger than Fortinbras. Its light seared the night sky and drowned out the stars in a grayish soup. It spewed light like a volcano, with fissures erupting all around it. As she telescoped in further, she could perceive that the cracks were roads leading from the core to the environs, where more suburbs, more light, extended all the way to a hazy horizon. This was no third city, some outpost for head ministry workers. The stadium, the voices, the people. The horrifying truth was coming together. The tower rocked beneath her. Even the glass in the red lamp rattled, followed by the boom of an explosion. A second shutter vibrated the floor underfoot. Then another blast followed from the northeast. She opened up the sound receivers on her headset, and a cacophony of running feet, shouts, and the unmistakable pop of projectile weapons filtered in through her earpiece. Infrared showed her a white blob descending from a ridge to the north. The mass broke into individual figures charging the wall. A third explosion, followed by 2 more. The wall was under attack. Floodlights on the walkways spun and burned down on the intruders, turning night into day. Men wielding projectile and plasma rifles stopped in the glare and fired upwards. Their assortment of ancient and current weaponry, their faded outdoor wear, their sand-stained faces told her who they were. Rebels. Believers. Many fell as fire from the wall rained down, their bodies slipping and tumbling down the slope of the ridge, sending up clouds of dust and cedar needles. But more came. They poured out of the cover of the forest. A flash to the west caught her eye. More rebels bolting down the next ridge over, their weapons sending salvos upwards at the wall. To the east, another arm of attack was surging forward from the cover of a ravine. Rebels swelled outward like ants emerging from a colony. Rockets left trails of smoke hanging in the air. The detonations blew out smoke and dust from the wall, sending forth a hail of cement shards. The wall forces countered. Gray and brown-clad soldiers in patrol suits like hers filled the walkways. Immediately below her, the rebels were focusing their attack on one of the reinforced maintenance doors at the tower base. Wall guards sent down a fury of plasma fire, the rose-colored plumes strangely beautiful in the evening light. Bodies of rebels began to pile up until a group charged with shields strapped to their arms. They bunched together and overlapped their shields above their heads. With exception of a few lucky shots that dropped some of their number, they moved closer to the wall, unhurt by the volleys of plasma. Guards from above dropped sonic charges, but they were set to timers, not for impact, so they clattered off the shields and rolled to the side, where they discharged with minimal damage to the rebels' flanks. A cluster of occultists under the cover of shields set grenades around the maintenance door, while soldiers on the tower top and walkways concentrated their fire, their shouts becoming increasingly frantic. They dropped more charges, these set to detonate on impact. The impenetrable shell of shields parted. A clump of rebels were scattered, their shields bent and limbs broken. But it was too late. The grenades exploded. The tower and wall swayed. Sabrina grabbed the railing. 3 wall guards dropped over the railings and fell to the ground. Their bodies disappeared in the spreading plume of dust and smoke. The red signal light was creaking and rocking behind her as she tried to steady herself. The base of the wall was hidden in a debris cloud. Guards fired into the wall of dust randomly. Sabrina switched to the infrared. Through the smoke and haze, she saw another wave of rebels streaming down the ridge. It was an avalanche of men. Their numbers were disappearing into the wall. The door was breached. They were inside, where they would find her, in her suit. They will take me for another soldier on the wall. Had Theopin known this? Was she a scout? An away party? A diversion? No. I'm a target. The scope of Theopin's betrayal came down on her like one of the towers themselves. Her skin felt aflame, despite the cold wind. Figures rushed about below. She grabbed her blaster, pausing when she realized her peril was still small. The wall guards were not likely to shoot her, as she looked like one of them. The rebels were still a tower away. She had time. All she had to do was escape, return to camp to tell Lindsay everything, and get away from Theopin and his cult. She would figure out where they would go later, but that city in the distance was a real option. A city. A whole city outside the walls. Save the details. Only immediate escape mattered now. Another explosion at the next tower sent soldiers tumbling from the top. Rebels poured out of the door onto the walkway. They had climbed quickly, and the tower had been overrun. They were taking no prisoners. Wounded guards crawling for cover were shot in the face. Some were tossed, still alive, over the side. A handful made a dash for Sabrina's tower, but they were shot by rebels who knelt to steady their aim. The soldiers fell one by one until only a single one remained. Even as he reached the door, he stumbled as a bullet struck his leg. The soldier let out a cry that sounded vaguely feminine before he slammed the door. Rebels raced down the walkway in pursuit as additional projectiles cracked against the stone and whanged against the door. 2 plasma grenade blasts lit the night and blinded Sabrina momentarily. They dissipated with a hiss against the wall, the stone cracking loudly from the incandescence. A door slammed on the far side of the tower. Sabrina crossed under the lamp and leaned over the railing. The one remaining soldier was pulling himself in the direction of the next tower, leaning heavily on the railing, his left leg bleeding and useless. Although he tried to stand, he kept falling, his helmet getting hung up on the railing. Out of frustration, he ripped it off his head. He was a she. White blonde hair slipped out of a tie and whipped around her face. She cried out as she strained to pull herself forward, even as another explosion shook the wall and sent her sprawling onto the walkway. From the vibrations, Sabrina already knew that the tower she was on was breached. She became aware of the wall guards clustering on the next tower over, their plasma rifles lit black against the red lights, watching their comrades struggle. They were not coming to help, and the poor woman knew it. Fear blanched her face. As the door behind her rang with more blasts from within, the wounded guard looked to her distant comrades at the next tower, then back at the door. In that instant, she resigned herself to her fate, propping herself against the wall, her injured leg out in front of her, and her good leg bent. She drew her blaster and braced it on her knee. Sabrina could not understand what was unfolding. The tower guards could see her. Why not come to her aid? There was no one to help. Except Sabrina. She had been watching as a bystander, but the guards at the next tower might be wondering why she did not act herself, clad as she was. They take me for one of their own. Escape was her priority, but when the woman looked up at her and their eyes locked, she knew she could not leave. She holstered her blaster, activated the suit's adhesive surfaces, and leapt over the side to descend carefully. But a second blast threw her from the wall, sending her into a free fall. She extended her left arm and flattened her palm against the passing surface. The glove pulled her close, but it was too much weight, too much speed to stick. She slid, her descent arrested, but ruining the glove. She swung a knee and foot. It was enough. She stopped abruptly as the visor flashed messages to her about structural damage to her left glove and compromised adhesive function. Just a short distance above the walkway now, she dropped the rest of the way and let the suit absorb the impact of the fall. She landed beside the woman, who pointed her blaster at her. "I'm here to help you," Sabrina said, noting the flash of confusion in the woman's expression. The woman made the split-second decision and reached out her hand. Up close, she was older than Sabrina had first guessed, at least 10 years her senior. Sabrina was pulling her to her shoulder when the wall exploded, sending them backwards in a swarm of debris. The heavy metal door landed just short of them, rocking on the ground, bowed and bent. Chunks of cement clattered around them. A cloud of smoke and dust billowed outward, choking them both. A mountain of rubble was collapsed in the hole formed by the explosion. The woman's blaster had been knocked beyond her reach. Sabrina groped for hers, raised it, and aimed into the chest of the first rebel that came scrambling through the cloud. He raised his rifle, but neither he nor Sabrina fired. "Sabrina?" "Bran!" He had strung bandoliers of grenades over both shoulders, crossing them over his chest. A number of holders were empty. His clothes were covered in dust and blood, his head wrapped in a scarf in the same fashion she had used crossing the desert. "Bran, what is going on?" "We're taking the wall. For supplies." "What are you doing here?" he said, turning the rifle on the woman and offering his hand. Sabrina took it and stood up. "Theopin sent me here. Gave me my suit back." "He didn't tell you about the assault?" "No. It's like... Never mind. Look. Can you see it?" she said, running to the railing and pointing. "It's a city. Larger than Fortinbras or Lysander, isn't it?" She swept her right hand at the lights in the distance, then turned to the woman, who had seen her face, strangely impassive. Sabrina grabbed her collar. "You better start talking if you want us to live. Is it bigger than Fortinbras?" "It is," she said, her words strangely accented. Bran pushed between them, his mouth a frown of resignation. "Sabrina, we're not taking prisoners." "Why not? We can learn what that city is. There might be other survivors from the cataclysm." He glanced at the light on the horizon, but a haze had materialized, and at this distance the city was only a faint glow. The buildings and roads were indistinct. Sabrina offered her visor. Bran refused. "She is an agent of the Ministry. You can't believe a word she says." No, she is not. I would know. I would have seen her before. Sabrina pleaded, revealing as much as she could without exposing her true connection to the head ministry. She shook the visor. Just look through the visor, Bran. Just look. I'm sorry, he said, looking over his shoulder at the gap in the wall. Sabrina could hear the other rebels clamoring over the rubble. There's already too much suspicion on Theopen's part. We can't afford to be insubordinate now. His eyes flashed pity before they hardened, and he raised the rifle, placing it against the woman's head. She closed her eyes as he tightened his trigger finger, but not before Sabrina put her blaster to Bran's chest and fired. A yellow stun flash popped in the air between them, and he stumbled back onto the rubble pile. Voices sounded from the other side of the shattered doorway. Sabrina and Bran stared at one another, both surprised that the stun blast had not rendered him unconscious. He felt his chest, jerking his hand away suddenly when he touched the grenade that was overheating. Crite, he said, trying to work the grenade that had absorbed the blast out of its sleeve. But the metal had already expanded, making it impossible to free. The explosive began to squeal. Take them off! Take them off! Sabrina cried, wrestling with the bandoliers. The strap of his rifle was tangled, and he had fastened the bandolier's ends tightly with double knots. I'm sorry, Bran, I'm sorry, she was saying as she reached for a knife in her boot to cut them, but the whine of the grenade had reached a higher pitch now. Bran turned, his arms stiff, and shoved her free of him before he stepped towards the railing. He spoke as much as, "Into your weapons," before he disappeared over the side. The wall exploded, the blast throwing Sabrina and the woman to the far side of the walkway, where the railing wobbled but stopped them from going over the edge. She watched as a rain of fragments sailed downward and smashed into the unforgiving ground. The smoke cleared. A massive section of walkway was now missing, and a portion of the tower had collapsed, blocking the gap Bran had crawled through. Rebels shouted and screamed from the other side of the wreckage, calling out for him, asking what had happened, heaving aside chunks of cement that Sabrina could hear and feel rumbling through the pile. Her vision blurred by tears, and her ears nearly deaf, Sabrina picked up the woman, flung her over her back, and carried her to the one clear patch of walkway against the tower. When she placed her glove against the surface, it slid down uselessly. The rubble beside her was moving. Red blasts of plasma sprayed between the fallen bricks. The rebels had taken to simply trying to vaporize the debris that remained. Bran's comrades were still calling his name. Sabrina listened, terrified that she would recognize a voice. A blast seared her left foot, the sensation so intense that it took her mind a few moments to settle on calling it pain. She began to falter, but the woman slapped her face. When she tried to speak, neither of them could hear. Sabrina lifted her arm to fire her grapple, the woman helping to steady it, clearly familiar with the mechanism. Even though Sabrina's elbow shook with exhaustion, the wire traced a graceful curve up the side of the tower as it unspooled. The glove transferred the tactile sensation of the smooth cement floor on the rooftop to her fingertips, which was quickly replaced by the rigidity of the grapple as it clutched the railing. "Hold on!" Sabrina croaked, hoping that the woman would understand her. The woman tightened her grip around Sabrina's neck, and the winches in the suit activated. The extra weight slowed them, the apparatus in her arm vibrating terribly. More blasts turned the rubble below into powder. Rebels broke through, but now that Sabrina and the woman were clear, the guards on the opposite tower opened fire, pinning the rebels to the door, sending one fighter down the crater left by Bran's detonated bandoliers. Sabrina found herself double-checking to make sure it was not Denalius, Sprocket, or Grange who fell. Whoever it was, he landed next to the remains of Bran's body. She watched the bundle of clothes that was left of her friend, painfully aware that he had now saved her life twice. And how did I repay it? They reached the roof of the tower and collapsed. The walkway on the far side was now teeming with rebels. Sabrina put her ear to the hatch and heard the unmistakable clatter of feet banging up a metal walkway. "They're coming," Sabrina said, readying her blaster. "The glider!" The woman screamed, pointed to the power set folded in the corner. Sabrina rolled it out and, following the woman's instructions, unfolded the wings and charged it, the twin turbines humming to life and cracking with blue flames. They struggled to lift it over the railing into the narrow ledge on the other side. With the woman's injured leg and Sabrina's burned foot, the best they could do was let it crash down, both of them leaning over precariously to keep from rolling off the edge. Sabrina was holding it steady as the woman belted herself in when the hatch on the tower deck opened. A rebel emerged, the back of his head thankfully turned towards her. "Crite!" Sabrina said, letting go with one hand to draw her blaster and fire a full jet of plasma at the hatch. The shot scattered in a bright flash and slammed the door back down. The glider began to cantilever over the edge. When it was clear Sabrina could not arrest its momentum, she let herself drop over the edge too. They fell, the glider, the woman, and Sabrina. The air rose into a roar about Sabrina's ears. The turbines spat flames, and she let go of her blaster and reached for the wing with her right glove, the only one with intact adhesive grip. The glove caught just as the turbines fired on full power, and the glider's trajectory changed. They were still plummeting, but now rocketed sideways, the thrusters slowly eating into their downward momentum. They made a sickening dip, wobbled, then soared, teetering from one side to the other. Sabrina was thrown back and forth, doing her best to avoid the engine's exhaust. She realized that her own weight and placement were making it impossible for the woman to steer the craft. Behind them, shooters were lined up on the tower and walkway. Bullets dented the airfoil on either side of her. Plasma blasts sizzled by her head. She smelled burnt hair. A blue flare erupted from the turbine to her right as a shot struck home, and the engine choked. The craft careened to the side, battering Sabrina against the wing before going straight down. Sabrina's last thought just before impact was that she was indeed cursed.